Thank you very much, Robert. So it's my great privilege that I was assigned this role to moderate opening panel on this occasion when we are going to celebrate 30th anniversary. Surely during afternoon we will be listening to thoughtful ideas by panelists, and in the evening we will meet at gala dinner, for which personalities like Madeleine Albright and President Zuzana Čaputová is supposed to come. So with this panel, I would like to kick off atmosphere for the whole afternoon, because second one will deal already mostly with pragmatic, and third even with more pragmatic and political issues. This wants to be also a little bit remembering where we were 30 years ago. And since we are in very special building, Bohemian Hall, which belongs to Czech Republic, this is also sort of our building, because it played very important role in Czechoslovak history. And on the plaque outside, which is covered by Globsec logo, which is kind of symbolical, it's written that Antonín Dvořák used to live in these buildings, in this building. So let's try to remember, and it was unveiled, that plaque by Jan Masaryk, son of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, in presence of Mayor of New York. So we are in a very historical place. So we will not do New World Symphony, but my quartet will do 30 years symphony, and I will start with brief introduction of 4 of them through my personal relations to them, because other than that you can learn and read their bios. Wendy Luers is difficult to classify, because some people say that donor or civil society activist, researcher here and there, so it's very difficult to put Wendy into some compartment, but Wendy is mover and shaker throughout all her world, all her life. And when I met Wendy 30 years ago, then she was already well known. She was friend with Václav Havel and dissidents in our country, because she stayed for some time with us. She will mention it, I'm sure. But also Wendy played profound role in emergence of civil society, particularly in Czech Republic and Slovakia. Since she has little medal, I was here in '95 when President Kovács awarded her state decoration. So Wendy was already decorated and is part of our history. Bill Moody is formerly, now he is retired, but he, for us, will be always remembered as one of the most responsive representatives of one of the most responsive philanthropy and donor. How we view those days in the early 90s American philanthropy. Bill was extremely valuable in showing us, teaching us how to do all these civic engagement issues, and was working with group of foreign donors, developing consortium, how to work together. He will surely touch upon this, and Bill recently traveled through the region, so he will be able surely to comment also, similar like Wendy, where are we now in this country and in the United States as well. Damon Wilson will represent on this panel thoughtful policy guy, since Damon worked in White House under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and he knows a lot our region through policy work. So I am sure that Damon, who is now Vice President of Atlantic Council in Washington, that he will frame some of the issues from earlier decades and compare them with today, where we are now. And most importantly, Damon and Jakub Wiśniewski, who is director from Globsec organization introduced by its founder Robert Wasz. Jakub is formerly Polish diplomat. He was ambassador to OECD, but he ended up in Bratislava and works at Globsec. So we have even Globsec is now attracting foreign talent. These are not only Slovaks who work at Globsec, and Jakub is one of the guys who is shaping policies and programs, projects which are trying to stimulate broader debate in country. And the two gentlemen, together with Rastio Káčer and Robert Vach, just signed agreement of cooperation between the two organizations, which is something very remarkable, because 30 years after the two organizations sign agreement, which are signs of the time, probably. We can touch upon that. With this introduction, I'm not going to take any more time, because I will ask panelists a few questions, and then I hope that we have altogether an hour and 20 minutes for this panel, that you would be able to add either some of your observations, because many of you, Lenka Suročák, Gail, and others, wherever I look at, I know somebody whom I am sure would be able to add few things to the topic. Wendy, if you would be so kind, Year of Miracles 89. This is a common question to all of you. Wendy, we will start. How do you remember year of Velvet Revolution or fall of Berlin Wall, and how all what happened then changed your personal and professional life?
Are we on? Is this on? No. Yes. It is? Okay. Well, you sent me some questions, and the first question was, how did I get involved in Central and Eastern Europe? And I think that leads very quickly into '89. My husband, Bill Luers, was American ambassador to Prague from 1983 to 1986. We wanted to continue the cultural exchanges and the cultural democracy that we had been doing in Venezuela when he was ambassador. And so we invited prominent writers and painters, Kurt Vonnegut, Bill Styron, Edward Albee, Richard Diebenkorn, Galway Canal, et cetera, to come and stay at the beautiful Peček Palace in Prague. Who are we going to introduce them to? We were going to introduce them to the thuggish Ministry of Culture people, or were we going to introduce them to the most interesting people in the country? And that was Václav Havel, Charta 77, Charter 77, all of the people that were stoking coal in the metros, or building walls, or doing whatever they could do, who were all the dissidents. And they were intellectuals, they were importantly citizens of their country that they wanted to change. And so we filled this beautiful palace with all of those people every week. And when we asked them in the beginning, are we going to get you into too much trouble if we invite you to the enemy's house, which was the American ambassador's residence, they said, oh hell, we're in so much trouble already, and you've got whiskey. And so, therefore, they became very close friends. And so in '89, we came back in 1986, we came to New York. Bill became president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But we kept in touch, and we kept going back every year to see our friends who were stuck behind the Iron Curtain without passports. And still writing and believing and thinking. But what most people don't realize is there were only a couple hundred of those people. This was not a huge mass movement. So in 1989, when the wall came down in Berlin, and Kochab said to Václav Havel, you're going to be the next president. And it happened, and there were 1 million people going from Letna all the way down to Wenceslas Square, and the world was watching. We flew back on Christmas Day in 1989, went to the Intercontinental Hotel in the same room, which still had the bugs in them, listening, because there was a whole line of rooms in the Intercontinental Hotel which had all of the listening devices in it. And we started the Chalupetsky Award with all of the artists. Havel sent a message saying, come tonight, which about 1920, I think it was December 27th. I brought a huge suitcase of clothes for Olga Havlova, because she had nothing but blue jeans and sweaters. And she was going to be the first lady of free Czechoslovakia. And we had always given an annual dinner at Usedmi Angelo at the Seven Angels in Old Town, and we had always had the STB guys following around all of the dissidents who came. So we gave the same dinner, except it turned out to be Havel's inaugural dinner. We told Václav, don't come, you're going to be president the next day. You got a lot to do. And he appeared in his black leather jacket with his 2 bodyguards who had ponytails. And and the next morning, he was in Vladislav Hall becoming president of Czechoslovakia. So that's how we got involved. And then what happened is that Jan Czarnogórsky, who had become deputy prime minister, he'd been out of jail for a couple of weeks. He was up in his new residence on the Hradčanské náměstí, up by the castle, and he said, "We have to have a constitution for free Czechoslovakia. You're going to help us, Wendy." And I said, "I'm not even a lawyer. How can I help you? But I know somebody who can." And his name was Lloyd Cutler, and he'd been general counsel in the White House, first for Carter and then for Clinton. I called him up and I said, "Lloyd, how would you like to help?" Because we'd brought him the summer before. "How would you like to help the Czechoslovaks to write the Constitution of free Czechoslovakia?" And of course, the rest is history.
Bill, the same question to you. When, how you got engaged and how it changed your professional life?
Well, I can use, I guess. Is that on? Is it on? It's working. That's good. Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's just a very special day to see friends from years ago, colleagues that I've worked with in various places, and so I thank you for adding me to this group discussion this afternoon. I'm just going to speak briefly about how the Rockefeller Brothers Fund actually became involved in grant making in Central and Eastern Europe many long years ago. The Rockefeller family had been internationally oriented and were involved in Latin America and Africa and many places, but back in the early 1980s, they were not involved in Central Europe, but one day a diplomat from Poland came to a UN event that David Rockefeller was attending and walked up to him and asked if his family would consider helping in Poland. There were really significant needs, and there are needs in all the other countries in Central Europe that are behind where they want to be in a not democratic framework. And so David, as he always did, David Rockefeller took this seriously and took it back to the RBF and talked with the presidents and the board. And since I had been one of the international people in charge of our work in Africa and Latin America, they came around to me and said, "Would you investigate? What might we do? What is the role for us?" And that led to a solid 20 years of grant making in Central Europe. And we started in innocent ways where there were political problems in Poland, and many of the people that were studying abroad and professors from Poland that were teaching abroad, they were being forced to come back if they couldn't get some financial support. And we set up, back in 1981, this is, the first program to help all of these people from Poland to stay until the whole situation back home cleared up well. And this led, as I said, to a long period of working in those countries, and I felt so fortunate to be able to be in charge of that work. And I'll have a chance to talk about other aspects of my work in the next questions.
Great. Damon, you were much younger than our two first speakers. Do you remember '89 and how it impacted your future career?
Pavel, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially with folks like Wendy and Bill, who played such an important role in the transformation of the region. And I was not in a position to play the kind of helpful role that you did at that time. I was in high school. But I had grown up in the South, a family that wasn't very internationally exposed. One of my best friends in third grade was the son of a dissident from Ceausescu's Romania. And as a kid in rural North Carolina, it became very palpable and understandable to me as a kid what it meant to grow up not free, what it meant to grow up under a totalitarian society. And it triggered in me something at a young age of a sense of understanding what it meant to be American, a sense of justice, and as someone who loved history, the injustice of history. So as a kid, I was obsessed with playing Risk and war games and reimagined how we could end World War II in a different way, where American troops would have been in different places in Europe and this region would be free. I imagined a free Ukraine. And so in high school, in 1989, when all of this began to unfold, it was really astonishing. And I was antsy. I didn't want to be in high school. I wanted to be over there. And so I went off to Duke University, and I spent every moment at Duke trying to figure out how to get over there. I spent in 1991, I moved to Estonia for the first time to be able to live in its first year of independence, to work in the foreign ministry as a student, while Lennart Meri was there as foreign minister preparing the groundwork to run for president. And to see people who were, frankly, at that time, not much older than me, shaping the destiny of their country, of their society. It's the first time I had a chance to go to Bratislava and experience what it was like to see this coming back to life. And so for me, my goal was to go work for Ambassador Vershbow, to go work for Dan Fried, to do what Sally Painter was doing on the Committee to Enlarge NATO. But I was inspired by you, by people like Pavel Dimish, by people like Rostislav Kacher. What you were doing inspired me to understand the potential power that Americans could have as a force for good, and simply standing behind you to support you in what you wanted to do. And so I missed '89, as Dan likes to. When I was interviewing for a job at the NSC with Condi Rice, Dan Fried said, this young man missed 1989, but he wants in right now because he wants to be part of the next chapter. And thank goodness, because of these folks, I was able to do that. And I was able to work on NATO enlargement, including to your country, help plan President Bush's trip to Slovakia, every round of NATO enlargement. But it's from being a kid in this country, blessed, unaware, but learning through the humanity of Ted Tatos, another 3-year-old, that this really matters. And it's not great if you don't have the ability to determine your own future. And to see the courage and leadership of from afar, a Havel, or from close up, a Lennart Meri, and to know that however we can, even on the margins, just to help push this in the right direction, that was an honor to try to catch up to '89.
Excellent. Jakub.
I think it's important to remember that in 1989, communism was already rotten, so it was far from totalitarian. And there was a little bit fun to it, at least from the perspective of a schoolboy. I was 12 years old. I remember suddenly Karl Marx as a portrait disappeared from our schoolroom, but the eagle on the Polish flag suddenly acquired the crown. I remember standing in line for hours and hours to buy bread on Friday. And of course, there was food rationing still. It must have been very unpleasant for my parents. But for me, it was fun, making pranks to each other on these long lines. I was able to stay even after dark because I was playing a useful role to the family. So to make a long story short, this was like explosion of something new. I detected that something is in the air. My parents were excited. Actually, it was the first time I saw, and probably the only time, when I saw them tipsy, when they had drinks, because they were laughing so much with happiness about what is happening. Without realizing myself, I was part of it. And it adds to my collage of memories of communism, and some of them are much less cheerful. And just very quickly to mention some of them. Martial law, introduction of martial law. It was a very sad, gray winter in Poland, and my parents were ready to emigrate. We all had tickets that would take us to West Berlin and further on to Germany. But suddenly something was wrong. My father turned on the TV, and here it was General Jaruzelski announcing that martial law is starting, and all the borders are closed. Nobody will travel anywhere. Actually, there is it is forbidden to leave your home after dark. I also remember America, but from the perspective of a child. I remember going to church for classes of religion because it was not at school. And because of these difficulties with food rationing, actually priest would deliver some food to us. I remember a priest standing over us, a group of children, and dividing huge piece of cheese. And I remember that on this cheese it was written Chicago, Illinois. And this is how I realized that somebody actually is producing this cheese and is giving it to us as a gift. And this is something I will never forget, even if it's not about GDP figures or some official help, assistance to Poland. I felt it myself. And maybe finally, I remember Chernobyl. Chernobyl, when we were all confused back in 1986, what's happening. Remember, it was no time for internet. You could not get proper information. And here again, America came because it was to Radio Free Europe that we turned for information. Because it turned out that Polish media lied. They would not be telling us the truth about what is happening. And it was already very pernicious, very harmful to stay outside. So the sad realization that you have your own government, your own Polish people at the top who lie to you because they are cowards, because they are servants to Moscow, and you only learn the truth from somebody else far away, maybe financed by Democrats in America, democratic people in America. So to conclude, what is now theoretical in our reports was very practical to a young boy back in Poland, very gray Poland.
Thank you, Jakub. Now, Wendy, you mentioned your role in sort of helping Václav Havel dissidents to come to power, helped with this constitutional reform, but you are mostly remembered this through helping to develop civil society. You even created foundation for a civil society, and I remember as early strategy what you outlined that, okay, I'm starting, but at some point you will have to take over, I'm just helping you temporarily. And I think that there are very few examples that somebody helped to develop indigenous, self-sustainable entities like Nadat Sevilla and Pontis Foundation. So if you remember those 90s, which sort of made common belief in concept of civil society, open, democratic civil society, and that was period when both US government and civil society groups, like both of you represented, had common narrative why they do what they do. Europe, whole, free, and at peace. Since we will be going and looking at today, how do you remember those 90s and how that strategy which you had to develop indigenous self-sustainable culture of civic engagement, do you remember and work? I mean, if you could share some ideas about that, what you had in mind, early 90s.
Well, it's a very long story, and I'll try to do it in 2 or 3 minutes. I'd never run an NGO. I'd worked for Amnesty International for 5 years and Human Rights Watch for 2. But it was perfectly obvious that we were the only Americans who knew these people, and they were asking for help. And we Americans had skills, and young Americans had skills that they didn't have because they didn't have any computers, they didn't have any of those things. And so we had a meeting at the Ford Foundation in January the 10th, 1990. With about 50 of the only people in the United States and CIA, State Department, et cetera, who would be interested in what was really going on. And Bill Luers had lunch sitting next to George Soros, and George said, I'm going to give Wendy an office and a secretary, because everybody was saying we need a point person. We need somebody who knows them and who knows us. And so George gave me $25,000 and office space for 3 years. And then that was the end of that. And without the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, without Bill Moody, without the rest of the US foundations who believed in me and in us, I was able to immediately start an office in New York, an office in Prague, and then an office in Bratislava in 1993, the day after Slovakia became a free country. What did we do? Well, we did everything on demand. We sent 500 young people over to teach English. They all paid their own way. They came from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, whatever, and they taught English because Havel said, I want people, young people to speak English. They had this cockamamie idea that they were going to turn Russian teachers into English teachers, which was ridiculous. And so those 500 Masaryk Fellows, as we called them, who came over and taught English are forever remembering and loving this country. We started, as I said, a lot of exchanges on the arts, which is going on. We started something very important with USAID. Over the years, we raised about $11 million. Of that, about $5.5 million was US government money. I'm not exactly the kind of person that technocrats and bureaucrats like to see wandering into their offices. So I didn't go into the offices very often, but I sent all the talented young people, and I never hired anybody who wasn't 20 years younger than I was, because they were the ones who were not going to intimidate the Czechs and Slovaks. They were going to be able to talk to the budget person at AID. They were going to be able to continue to have the kind of relationships that were necessary. So what did I mean by on demand? Well, there was something that the US government was kind of thinking about, and it turned into the Democracy Network. And I think I'll use this as an example of how do you build civil society. Democracy Network was a government-funded project, in which it was supposed to be small grants to small organizations. In the beginning, people would come up to us and say, scrap of paper, and say, give me the money. And we would say to our funders, to the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., leave this to us. You have to trust us that we know how to do this. We mean to reject a grant request, and we will help that little organization, wherever it is, across Czechoslovakia and then in each country, to develop a board, to develop some transparency, to develop the skills and a budget, and et cetera, that is necessary for them to do something as tiny as cleaning up a schoolyard. Bill Moody and the other funders, but particularly Bill, was in the region all the time. And that's the second part of this. We were on the ground. We had offices in each country. We had young people. But they, as funders, came, they saw, they helped, they suggested, they added money. And the Democracy Network is now in every developing country around, I guess around the world, I don't know. The Beltway bandits took them over. We used to give out grants, $20. $100, whatever it was. A now defunct Beltway bandit, I have to get this in here, named AED, which was closed down for corruption, beat us out in Bulgaria for the Democracy Network, the second round. They had 47 vice presidents. We had 47 people in 3 offices. That's the difference. The difference is that you have to be at scale. You have to be on the ground. I went to Prague and Bratislava 75 times in 9 years in order to just be there for the young people who were doing it for themselves. And the most successful nonprofits, except for people in need in the Czech Republic, are Lenka Sorocak and Nadacia Pontis from Slovakia, Jiří Barta and Nadacia Via in Prague, with major budgets of millions of euros, who are continuing this very important work at the grassroots level, listening to what people need.
Excellent. Bill, you, and we have Meryl in the room also, one of the 3 of you who studied philanthropy and all what various donors have done. You traveled extensively, you prepared this report, and we are very proud that we are the first who will be listening some pieces of wisdom, what you discovered from the behavior and impact of donors in Central and Eastern Europe.
Well, thank you. I'm only going to speak a very short time on this, and then I will turn to my colleague, Meryl Sovern, who will go a little bit more into depth. But from my background, since I had started working in Central Europe in 1982 in terms of grant making and was able to make grants even in the days before 1989. And of course, 1989, we'll never forget 1989, and ever. And then we were able to expand in the 1990s and continued making grants until 2012. And we thought that, in fact, a lot of the organizations that we supported would be in pretty good shape after a lot of support, some of which was for starting endowments and for expanding programs. But there weren't that many funders that were helping with that long term. So that, in fact, when I went back to Central Europe back in 2010 and after I retired in 2012 and 15, so many of these groups were struggling to keep going to work on civil society and all kinds of issues. And then we could see what was happening in Hungary and in Poland. The governments were really trying to diminish the roles of these independent civil society groups and civic engagement groups, so that Barry Gaberman, a retired Ford Foundation vice president, and Meryl Sovern, who is at the Center for Civil Society at City University and working on her PhD, and I actually started a research project looking at a group of nonprofit organizations and what they went through and what's the status of civil society in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm going to turn now to Meryl to really give the more detailed explanation.
So we've been able to share with you our executive summary of our report. We're very pleased. It's coming out shortly, but you're getting an advance peek through this executive summary. As Bill was saying, Barry Gaberman and I traveled through 15 countries, interviewed over 250 people to look at the legacy of 5 pooled funds that were set up from 1991 to 2007. And we found a lot of some of what you've heard here, that the institutions formed in the early 1990s have become key players today. But yet, civil society organizations are struggling a lot. The kind of flexible funding based on shared values and trust that Wendy was talking about is not available now. And organizations are beholden to project funding, which forces them to look at specific deliverables. It forces them to focus only on those and not invest in their own organizational development, take on new projects in a quickly changing environment. There's also less resources for what are called infrastructure organizations, the ones that support civil society as a whole, and they're the ones that do the advocacy when new laws are proposed or amendments to the regulations governing civil society organizations. So I won't go into more detail because you have the executive summaries in front of you, but I'd be happy to talk further about it to anyone who's interested. Thanks.
So, with this, Damon, you are not from civil society, but rather from political community. You entered differently than Wendy and Bill. But I will give you a hard question related to one philanthropist who was mentioned, George Soros, who helped Wendy and several others, or many others. What is phenomenon of anti-Soros movement in Central and Eastern Europe, and probably also in the United States? Tell us.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that one. Look, I came to civil society from government. So I'm at the Atlantic Council now, which I very much consider part as a civil society actor. but came from working in the U.S. government, working at NATO, where our perspective, as I learned from those in this room, Ambassador Fried and others, our perspective was to breathe oxygen into freedom fighters as individuals and to civil society as entities. One of the things where we spent some time was really being struck by how strong a lot of the civil society was in the region, particularly in Slovakia, where you had a double whammy of having to have sustained and refought for a sense of democratic freedoms in Slovakia in order to get back in the queue to join NATO, that we really saw this muscle movement of civil society as an incredible asset of the national brands of these countries. When President Bush came to Bratislava, we gathered generations of freedom fighters, from those who had survived the Holocaust, resisted communism, were there at '89, to those who were on the front lines of freedom still in Serbia, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. But what we really invested in over time was an understanding that what Slovakia in particular and others were doing were lessons learned, and were able to do what, Wendy, what you did, was whether it was Belgrade or later in Tunisia or elsewhere globally, these were some of the best champions and practices to do this. This synergy between sort of government, individual, freedom fighter, civil society, I think is what helped us fuel the democratic wave. Now we're in a backlash. Now we're in a democratic recession. We're in a populist backlash a bit, and for good reason. You know, my relatives who really don't understand what goes on in Washington can say, the elite kind of failed us with an economic recession, wars that didn't end, rural development that's been challenging. And so we're seeing now the testing in our own societies of this pressure. And I think it's in this context, twofold, that there's been a questioning of some of these actors, and so that's played out big time as Soros has been made to be positioned as a challenger, as an enemy in certain places, as promoting values that might be disruptive, but also a reality that this gets crosswise with politics, and that the things that we care about and fought for, and even today at the Atlantic Council, are really greater than politics. They operate in a political environment, but they're meant to transcend above that. There were some principles and values. And the thing that was beautiful about our community was that Slovakia, the Czech Republic, other countries in the region were rejoining Europe, but they were joining our team, they were joining our institutions of NATO and the European Union. But what made us, and our team, were that we were free peoples. And so it was our identity of being free that brought us together. And I think now we're going through a little bit of a convulsion politically in defining who we are, what's the relationship between our national identity, these broader communities, where I fear that we're losing sight of the real challenge that we're in today is a free people, a free world that's being challenged by authoritarian kleptocrats. And so no matter what your politics are, Soros or not, Swedish leftist or Trump Republican, we are free people in free societies. And we might not realize it, but our adversaries are coming after us and our model and our ideals. And right now, we're sort of tearing each other apart a little bit in our own polarized politics, when the real game is a bigger game.
Very good. I somehow wanted to bring this angle, and Jakub, if you could continue along this, because through the support of various philanthropies, governmental program of the United States throughout 90s, early 2000s, in 2004, Big Bang enlargement, our countries joined the European Union. So we thought that we are stepping and creating something lasting, unshaking, from the point of view of common values. Overall narrative, Europe whole free and at peace, was generally shared by Americans and by all of us Europeans. And it was navigating us in both in civil society development, politics, and so on. But nowadays, somehow, we are having zillion conferences about disruption and about the shrinking space and so on. At Globsec, you recently published these trends when you are looking at Central and Eastern Europe as of today. So if you could tell us some of the key elements, how Central Europeans, what's the state of development within the region, but also how Central East Europeans view United States and its role in international arena, particularly towards Central and Eastern Europe.
Gladly, I will do it. But before, let me just quickly turn to the issues that were raised by my predecessors. If Western societies, America, is confused or are confused, what to think of countries, societies who were put into the icebox of 50 years of communism, where you don't have a normal development, you don't have democratic institutions in operations. It was all facade under communism. So today in Poland and Hungary, when they look at the questions of judiciary or how the free media should operate, the very question that they pose is not problematic in itself. It's understandable that you reach for a good model. But the problem is that if there is a lack of understanding, especially on the part of a common man, what he wants and why freedom of the press is something absolutely invaluable to the country, then we get into trouble, because you don't have a critical mass. In contrast to, say, America, where you have maybe, some people say, not very responsible president, but you have counterbalance in the form of institutions, civil society, in terms of courts, in terms of many, many people and actors who are relevant. And in Central Eastern Europe, this is much more complicated, much more subtle and problematic. Think of ideas which turn people's attention these days: climate change, ecology, green development. This is all making a little difficult entry into Central Eastern European minds, because they were out of this debate for many years. They have yearned for capitalism. They wanted to have all these cars. They wanted to have, I don't know, level of life which is present in Western Europe or the United States. And before they achieved it, actually, just at the moment when they are entering into this promised land, they are told, no, cut back. It's not good that you need to recycle. You need to be much more modest. Don't eat meat, etc., etc. I'm exaggerating, but I'm showing you that the Central Eastern European mind is complicated. So we should not be surprised that in the overall confusion and disruption, problems arise in Poland and Hungary and beyond. And now, quickly, I turn to the questions that you pose. Yes, we do the public opinion trends, and they are very interesting. We study the 4 countries plus Bulgaria and Austria, and we learn a lot about attitudes concerning America. And it appears that America has ceased to be a point of reference, a friend, a mentor for all these societies. Actually, very often, Russia emerges as an important actor. For example, 70% of Bulgarians think that they share values more with Russia than America. Half of the 4 countries or societies think that they belong somewhere in between the East and West. So half of people, they have not realized that they are part of European Union and NATO and transatlantic community. 4 people in 10 in Central Europe would prefer some European army from NATO. They are distrustful of NATO. And so these are worrying trends that show that we need badly back America in the US. What was talked about here about 90s, early noughties, it has gone from much of a mainstream of politics, but also societies of Central Eastern Europe. To a degree, European Union has stepped into this void, but it's not enough, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. You traveled throughout the region while you were working on these studies. Did you have similar feeling like what these research data are showing, talking to people in the region?
There are similarities that were really quite bothersome. Just to give a couple of examples, was the way in which the Russians had so carefully infiltrated radios and television programming throughout Central Europe and beyond what they've done in the United States, and people don't really talk enough about what that means, but we certainly heard it in every country that this was really influencing some young people, and they weren't figuring out the best ways to stop it. And in fact, one person even told me, and I don't know how broadly this is, that even the Russian churches are getting cozier with the Central European churches. And what does this mean in terms of Sunday school classes? Who is really being considered to be the wonderful people, and who are the people you have to be watching? So even that's scary for me to see things penetrate like that, which gets me back to a comment I've made at various occasions, that our people in the West, in the United States in particular, but also probably in Central Europe, are not learning enough about democracy and civil society in the elementary, secondary, or even at the university levels. So we're not taking advantage of some of the things we need to do. So what I can't resist saying is that Rolf Dahrendorf, a name that's familiar to many of you, was a professor at Oxford for such a long time, wrote a book in believe it or not, it was in 1989. And the key things that he wanted to point out there was that it takes 6 months to build a market economy, 6 years to build a parliamentary democracy, and 60 years to build a civil society. And we don't take to heart the length of time we really, as societies, need to devote to really go in the direction. And clearly, the 1990s wasn't long enough in many respects. So I hope people will remember this, and I'll stop there with my laryngitis.
But I would just add that Lord Dahrendorf passed away before social networks started to be active in our lives. Wendy, you are always practitioner. You heard some of these rather sort of sad data about perception of America in countries where US, both public, private institutions, invested so much time, money, energy, and so on. 30 years after, we end up in this type of rather unpleasant data from the point of view of us sitting in this room. What should we do collectively? We Americans and, you Americans and we Europeans, in order to deal with these trends, which are not very pleasant.
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not going to be terribly optimistic that you're going to have U.S. foundations or U.S. government monies funding the building of civil society in Central and Eastern Europe today. I mean, that's yesterday's story, and it's going to stay yesterday's story. It has to do with doing it for yourselves. And that was, of course, why I left behind 2 offices that are now enormously successful. But at the time that you entered in 2004, and we provided expert advisors who spoke Czech and Slovak to the ministers themselves to help them help the ministers, not the French or the British or the Americans who they thought were trying to get money from them or business from them. We provided people that were sitting right there with the ministers. And in 2004, when you joined the European Union, you were supposed to become donors. You were supposed to help the other countries that needed more. And we had hoped at that point that that would engender a philanthropic sense among the peoples. Now, it's perfectly understandable why people, especially nouveau riche or newly riche people, did not immediately think it was their job to help other people, particularly in advocacy and civil society. I'm not talking about children with cancer. I'm talking about the stuff that takes 60 years to engender. And so I'm looking at Lenka here because she has managed through something, a little tiny example. I'm going to give 2 examples of things that have endured. One of them was called the Via Bona, that we started with Citibank back in 1991 or 92, in which we gave a prize to the corporate philanthropy and corporate citizenship. There was no such word for corporate citizenship in the Czech or Slovak language, period. It didn't exist. So this was an entirely new concept. Bill and I were in Bratislava a couple of years ago for the 25th anniversary of Via Bona, and there were 700 CEOs and 300 people who had been invited that couldn't get in, and it was televised to the nation that there were corporations that were being good and giving money to little civil society organizations and were being celebrated for it. That's the kind of indigenous, inside the country kind of philanthropy that has to happen. And it can happen, and it will happen, but it has to be done in a very intelligent, non-imperial way. It has to come from below. And the second thing that I'm going to say as an example, and actually there's a third, the second thing is that when the two offices in Prague and Bratislava became Nadace Via and Nadace Pontis, Via in Prague, Pontis in Slovakia, we had a Young Visual Artist Award that we'd started with Václav Havel and a group of artists. That was the Chalupetsky Award and then the Čepan Award in Slovakia. And they all said, all these young people said, what does the arts have to do with democratization? I mean, come on. I mean, you keep that. So we kept it. It's now in 12 countries. There are now, from Albania to the Czech Republic, there are now 12 NGOs in 12 countries that are still alive because they give a prize that brings a young visual artist to the United States for a residency. Now, this is tiny, but it is an example of the kind of thing that you can do that is not at 40,000 feet. It's way down there in the bottom. The last thing I'd like to say is George Soros and the Soros Foundations have done a fantastically wonderful job. They didn't give us anything, but they have given, but as Bill Moody will absolutely testify, the fact that there was a flow of money, a guaranteed flow of money to all of the Soros Foundations in all of these countries meant that when George left, and he only gives 10% of all of his money to Europe now, those people did not have the drive nor the experience to raise money for themselves because they'd never had to. And lastly, in the United States, it's not completely a lost cause because I'm looking at Pavla Niklova over here, and we started the Václav Havel Library Foundation here in New York. It is now thriving. It is keeping the legacy alive. So these things, these connective tissue can happen, but it isn't easy.
Excellent. I would just like to add, Robert is one of the examples. NGO called Globsec is the largest NGO in Slovakia dealing with policy relevant issue, 80 staff from 12 countries. I think that, and also Robert reported today at advisory board that out of all funding, no donor gives more than 10%. So they are not dependent on anybody, from either government or corporation. So I think there are several types of innovations already which are taking place. But since time is running and we have 20 minutes left for this session, I was telling my panelists that we will reserve 20 minutes for your comments, questions, to what you heard. Either there is something what you would like to ask, or whether we were missing something fundamental from this topic of civil society, democracy building, and so on. Please just raise your hands and identify yourself. Sally.
Sally Pater. We're going to need a mic, I think. I want to go back to Damon's response and ask it in another way. How did we lose the narrative? We lost the narrative, and I don't know how we get it back. How could Soros be so demonized after having so much good? And I got into an argument with Orban last year on this topic, and he said, when I said, you've got to be more open or think about this, and I wasn't telling him what to do, but I was trying to do it in a way that he would be on receive, and he basically said to me, how many free and fair elections do we need to have before you don't think you need to be there anymore? You're not doing what we need anymore, and they're not asking us to. So what is our role now in Hungary? The Hungarians aren't asking us.
Okay, let's create space for Damon to think through the answer. Let's collect 2 more questions. He will develop more elaborate answer to this. So, next comment, question from the audience. Please, go ahead. Microphone, please.
I will support Wendy, whatever she says, which has been a long history of my supporting Wendy.
Yes, husband of Wendy Luhr's Ambassador Bill. He supports everything what Wendy said.
The core question which came up, which you raised, Pavel, is the difference between Soros and what Bill and Wendy were talking about. And it's top-down versus bottom-up. And it's so simple. It's such a simple difference. Both of them contributed enormously. Soros had in mind building open societies, and he wanted to do it with a bang. He was going to pour money in, and he was going to get the job done. He was going to get it done his way. Today, wherever we go and find people working in civil society, usually the one person who's still standing and strong is the Soros person who was selected. He's had a tremendous responsibility for seating some individuals in certain parts. But what Wendy and Bill did was say, tell us what you want, and we'll work with you to do what comes naturally, and we'll learn from you. But it was their drive, and it's the drive of Lenka Siročik behind us here, who turned that foundation in Slovakia into just a giant. And she did it herself and with the group, and there were no Americans were involved once it got started. So I think it's the top-down versus bottom-up that's key.
I hope that if Jan Suročák would be here, he would fully endorse what Lenka would like to say. One question over there, and then Lenka, if you would like to say anything, surely even without Jan, you would be allowed to have question.
Pavel, there was a program where the State Department was sponsoring a number of civil society leaders, including yourself. I think there were 7 of you, and the mission was for you to help other leaders around the area, region, Georgia, Ukraine, wherever, make the transition to liberal democracy and so forth. I think we called you the Magnificent Seven. And so my question is that program still going? Are you still actively mentoring other, I think there was a relationship at one point between Slovakia and Tunisia, for example. Is there anything going on in that space nowadays?
Okay, thanks. So we will have second round of questions, but I think Damon is now fully ready to answer the question.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me put it in a little bit of context first, because the ground shifted, and Orban has responded to that. And in part, it's easy to be concerned and critical about where we are today, but where do we come from? And so for about 20, 25 years, we had sort of clarity of vision and a strategy and policies that backed it up. When I went to work for Ron Asmus under Secretary Albright, and then out to NATO for Dan Fried and Condi Rice, we had a bipartisan approach that said, we're going to actually, as we work to forge a new kind of strategic partnership with Russia, something that Sandy Vershbow and others worked on, we're going to do that in a way that gives us the opportunity, gives us oxygen to start to turn former adversaries into allies and begin a credible process of NATO enlargement. And that's going to provide an umbrella for the deepening of Europe and what became really a deepening of the European Union. And that was a Europe whole and free as a vision, operationalized as a strategy, and we had a good 25-year run. We brought in 4 rounds, and then we hit 2008. 2007, Putin comes to Munich and says, deal's off, I don't want this anymore. We didn't believe him, we didn't want to listen to it. 2008 Bucharest summit, it fell apart. For the first time, Germany and the United States Germany blocked the United States. We really split on a decision about how to continue the democratic advanced east to Ukraine and Georgia. We slipped in Albania, Croatia, thank goodness, but we hit a roadblock. And from then on out, our formula began to break down. The Russians weren't playing ball. They wanted to reject that, reverse the gains of the Cold War. And we didn't have a strategy for advancing the democratic East. Things sort of settled down in some respects. We decided, okay, that's over to the EU, Eastern Partnership. We got bigger fish to fry, Middle East, rise of Asia. things are sort of normal with where we had seeded this in Hungary and Central Europe, normal European democracies. They were getting rich. So we could step back. And as we kind of took our eye off that ball, in part because we lost the strategy going east, the Russians didn't take their eye off the ball. They started to move. They started to seed. They started to see opportunities to push back that democratic advance, to sow mistrust in our societies, and to play a game. And you talk to someone like Orban, who was on the front lines of championing this advance in his youth, who then got to a stage and he said, look, I found myself alone. My country was totally in a box on energy. I couldn't get Poland. I couldn't get Romania. I couldn't get Croatia. I couldn't get Brussels. I couldn't get Washington to help me on energy. I had to go cut a deal with Putin to save my own country. You left me on my own. I'm going to figure out how Hungary can survive because I don't see any leadership around here. It's not coming from Berlin. It's not coming from Brussels. It's not coming from Washington. Not to justify any actions at home, but this is a little bit of that narrative. So we've woken up to all this, and it's not that we're to blame for what's happening in the region, but it does underscore that we've lost our center of gravity, our purpose, our North Star, our voice. And it was that North Star, that voice, that kind of got us all in the same direction. We've got a vision, a strategy, we've got things to do together. And that's what, that's partly what, I hope you will speak to this, Dan, that's partly what Dan and others are trying to do right now. How do we set out not what we're against, because now we saw, okay, we're waking up to the fact that the Russians arrived and started to chew back on those gains. Now China's arrived, and we don't even know where that's going to go. And now we're starting to grapple with, okay, how do we get back on our game? We've got to inoculate, educate our populations so that misinformation is less effective. But I think more importantly is we have to right our ship on what we want, what we believe in, what we're fighting for, and how we can align our free societies behind a greater cause. Because right now that's not animating. And so part of this is to remind all the countries that join NATO, you are on our team permanently, and our team is defined by being free societies. But Dan, please jump in on this. I can see you're itching.
Jakub, you wanted to add something?
Okay, I want to say that to me, Soros is not a problem. He is just a symptom of a disease. So if Soros did not exist, Orban would invent something else. Exactly like Kaczynski is doing. For Kaczynski, the enemy is the transvestite, LGBT person who corrupts our families and wives and children, little children who learn how to be gay. And I'm not joking. This is the official narrative of the public media. The same applies to Slovakia, where the boogeyman is some imperialist American soldier who is coming to take over the sovereignty of Slovak society. So the problem is within these societies, and probably it's for another discussion. What America can do? First of all, expose disinformation when there is foul play. Very often, these narratives, they are maybe born in crazy mind of some semi-dictator of Central Europe, but they are repeated all over again through all these social media, and this comes from the East. And this is where America, with its own technology, with all its people, with money to expose certain mechanism, can help. Secondly, America cannot force anybody to change their mind, even if their mind is twisted. I think this is rather the role of the European Union, because Poland and Hungary, having joined the EU, they subscribe to certain values. And if these values, they are about freedom of speech and fight against hate speech and fight against downright lies in the public media, and also the checks and balances system that is created through independent judiciary. So the point I'm making, if there is anybody to take a stronger line, it's the European Union, for example, by withholding certain funds from the regional policy. America should be rather a friend, advisor, and a patient actor who explains how democracy works, and actually this is not the way that we all agreed together when the glorious change happened 30 years ago.
Thanks. Todd Sedgwick, you were asking this question whether still the sharing lessons of Slovak transition with others goes on. Yes, it is going, because we have now Slovak aid, like you have USAID, we have Slovak developmental assistance mechanism, which is one of the areas which supports projects of Slovak NGOs, but also business and other types, but NGOs quite prominently, to deal with transition in Ukraine, Balkans, and so on. Particularly Eastern Partnership countries and Western Balkans are among top priorities. And just example, Globsec helped to shape Belgrade Security Forum, which is most prominent platform taken annual conference in Belgrade. Slovak Foreign Policy Association is now dealing with helping Macedonia in their pre-accession steps, how to develop dialogue after they resolve name issue. Pontis has several projects dealing with non-Slovak projects and so on. So I think that it is already embedded into our overall developmental assistance logic, and public-private partnership between Slovak NGOs and foreign ministry, under which the Slovak aid is, I think it's among those success stories which I would like to mention. Now, we have last 5 minutes. Lenka, I think you wanted to, and then where? Yeah, then we'll do the overarching narrative thing, which since Damon challenged him. Lenka, please.
I just actually wanted to say thank you for all the kind words, but not just for that, but I just really wanted to say that almost everybody who is in this room deserves thanks, because nothing in our societies would be possible without so much of your personal, involvement and your personal energy. And I'm just so glad that, once we always had you, we always had the courage, you came with the innovation, that kind of seeing, behind the corner. But also, I think I'm very glad that then companies like EY then stepped in and started helping. For me, it's very important that we also started together, and you already mentioned it, to build the Slovak aid, which kind of helped the other countries and went on. Peter Hulani is here as somebody who was at the beginning, there building Slovak aid. But what I wanted to say when I noticed that Mr. Sachs, who will be talking next, came in, and Damon, you started saying it, we have to go together, not just because of our countries or because of the US, but together there are bigger issues and bigger mission, bigger vision, and I would say more global problems where we can actually, hold hand and go and try to find that. And I would say maybe the Agenda 2030, the UN sustainability goals might be something, for which we can start striving. And I would like to say maybe more optimistic version to when I look at young people. We have a generation of young people, and that was something when they already saw that the young generation will bring the future. Young people who are very aware about the climate change, about the poverty, and who are willing to put their energy behind those issues. So just that.
Thank you. So today there was climate march not only in New York City but in Bratislava as well. So we are in the same boat with this. Dan Fried, then you are the last one. If you want to give us your assessment or answer some of the challenge of this narrative, what Damon was referring to.
I'm going to take a relatively optimistic take. I think the trends, the public survey trends that Jakub mentioned are shallow and reversible, but not by themselves. I think the United States believed that Central Europe was finished business and we could walk away. We had other things to do. That's not just the Trump administration. A lot of it is the Obama administration. I think we can get it all back, but to get it back, we can't go all nostalgic. I mean, I love it. 1989, best thing ever. We're not going to go back. We shouldn't go back. We need to have a narrative going forward, and things like common efforts on climate to reverse climate change, something that appeals to a 21st century. But at the basis of that is the democracies getting their act together at home and with each other, and then I think we're going to be okay. I really do. That may be my naive American optimism, but so I'm going to go back to the past. When the Lures were living in Prague, one thing was certain: the Iron Curtain was forever. Okay, that's nice.
Great. With this, I would just Dan Fried you want to say? Okay.
Let me add to the optimistic side of this. All of you know, President Chaputova was elected because young people took to the streets. You know that in Prague there have been, and all over in Brno and all of the smaller cities, there have been enormous marches. There is something called Freedom Festival, which has been doing, young people doing things in 40 different towns around. I don't know as much about Poland and Hungary, but these things are happening. And Bill's been asked to speak at Wenceslas Square on November 17th by the young people. And so, as we have discussed, and what Dan was saying is that GlobeSec and other major think tanks and organizations need to address the questions that the young people are interested in through social media and understand that they're willing to go to the streets and to be active. And so we need to capitalize upon that.
Great. With this, since you will be able to listen to President Zuzana Čaputová tonight, I found it fascinating that when she took office and made her first trip was to Prague, and first most important symbolical gesture she did, she went to graveyard of Václav Havel and put flowers on that. She went to Budapest and put flowers on Arpad Gönczi, and went to Poland and said how Lech Walesa is inspirational. So I think that there are still things which are linking those early values, energy, sensitivity, what we went through and discussed on this panel. And also one lovely link with which I'm finishing the panel. I was having coffee with newly arrived US ambassador. Since America was sensitive enough, they said that, okay, if you elected first female president, we are sending first female ambassador. She just said that the main teacher of her in diplomacy was Dan Fried. So I think that with his last comment and with this arch which I made, I would like to thank very much quartet of this Wendy, Bill, Damon, and Jakub, and thanks very much to all of you for very attentive and active audience. Thank you very much, and coffee break.